Okay. So every once in a while, I won't have time to get the bell work posted. So what I'll do is I'll go in there and I'll post the answers to all of these questions. So you guys just get kind of a day off essentially from it. Um, Okay, so the 18th century witnesses a massive software update to human thought, completely rewriting the operating system of how people understood the universe. This intellectual movement is known as the Enlightenment, an era where thinkers tossed out blind dogma and replaced it with reason, scientific discovery, and a sense of individual liberty. German philosopher Immanuel Kant issued the ultimate challenge of the era, telling humanity, dare to know, have the courage to use your own understanding. So instead of relying purely on ancient texts, Enlightenment thinkers used cool new technology upgrades like the microscope and telescope to observe the natural world, run precise experiments, and calculate mathematical laws. The so called Age of Reason grew directly out of the 16th century scientific revolution, which disrupted humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. For centuries, the prevailing belief had been that the Earth sat motionless in the absolute center of everything, and we see that this changes with Nicholas Copernicus, who dropped a major lore rewrite in 1533 by proving the heliocentric theory of the universe, that Earth and the other planets actually revolve around the massive star, the Sun. So later in 1687, English scientist Isaac Newton goes on to discover gravity, showing that universal mathematical laws govern everything from an apple falling off of a tree to the orbit of the moon around planet Earth. Newton's physics suggested that the cosmos operated like a perfectly crafted clock in a complex simulation game. As these scientific breakthroughs spilled over into the religious, philosophical, and political realms as well, as a group of thinkers known as deists, which influenced heavy hitters like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, to name a few, argued that God had built the universe and established the laws of physics, but then, after winding up the clock, had decided to step away from it all. All right, so letting it run without direct intervention. So deists believed that human suffering didn't come from inherent sin, but from pure ignorance of natural laws that the process of education could fix and help us to prevent all of this from happening. So in politics, thinkers like John Locke argue that governments only exist through the consent of the governed to protect natural rights, like our liberty and freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. So no one embodies the American Enlightenment better than Benjamin Franklin. Born in 1706, he ran away to Philadelphia, bought a print shop at age 22, retired wealthy at age 42, and he was the ultimate real-life polymath, a person with very vast knowledge across completely and totally different fields, essentially maxing out every skill level that he possibly could. Franklin founded a public library, a volunteer fire department, the American Philosophical Society, and the University of Pennsylvania. And as an inventor, he created the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, and the efficient Franklin stove, as his relentless curiosity and devotion to critical thinking proved that using human reason could remake society for the better. Drake, he's not here. Oh, there he is. He's right there. See him on. Sorry, I got so used to you not being here that now you're here. So, um, thank you. I apologize for that, but um, anyway. All right, so New Yorkers in 1689 celebrated the Glorious Revolution as if they had just defeated the final boss, sending a thank you letter to King William for saving them from tyranny. And the new king dismantled the oppressive dominion of New England, but the celebratory mood evaporated from Great Britain as it began patching what it saw as an economic exploit called colonial smuggling. Parliament issued the act to prevent frauds and abuses in 1696 to force compliance with the Navigation Acts. This law introduced writs of assistance, essentially broad, unrestricted search warrants that gave customs agents complete clearance to search colonial property without specifying what they were looking for. So accused smugglers were dragged into Royal Admiralty courts, bypassing local colonial juries, who almost always let their neighbors off of the hook. Then comes a massive shift in imperial strategy that felt like server admins going completely AFK. When German-born monarchs George I and George II took the throne, they paid very little attention to the colonial enforcement, and Prime Minister Robert Walpole instituted a policy of salutary neglect between 1721 and 1742, which deliberately ignored the trade violations because strict enforcement was simply too expensive and very difficult to maintain. What Walpole failed to realize was that leaving the colonies unmonitored for decades allowed for them to level up their own economic independence, creating a mindset where American colonists basically felt that they could ignore royal authority whenever it suited them, which, if you know anything about monarchies, is not really the case. They don't like that. So by the mid-1700s, American colonists had quietly built their own government systems, managing local affairs, like experienced strategists running their own custom server. And each colony established an elected legislative assembly, known variously as the House of Burgesses, House of Delegates, the Assembly, it just depends on where we're talking about, which held power over local taxation issues and the appointment of colonial officials. So because land was far easier to acquire in North America than in overcrowded Europe, a much higher percentage of men met the property qualifications to vote and to hold public office, creating a far wider voter base than anything that is really seen in Britain. And the broader participation meant that colonial assemblies weren't always filled with polished high society aristocrats either. In 1744, a shocked New Jersey critic complained that the colony's assembly was populated by mechanics and ignorant wretches obstinate to the last degree. While wealthy elites still had held significant influence in the colonies, everyday artisans, farmers, and tradesmen more frequently won elections and shaped policy, and this tradition of self-representation embedded a firm expectation amongst the colonists that their local assemblies held genuine authority, setting the stage for the confrontation with Parliament, eventually whenever they try and reassert their control. So the territorial showdown that ignited the full-blown global conflict over control of a single river valley, making it the ultimate real-life turf war in America. Between 1756 and 1763, the British Empire squares off against France and its Catholic ally Spain in what is known as the French and Indian War to American colonists, and the 7 Years' War on the global scale. Unlike earlier imperial skirmishes that ended in stalemates, this war concluded with a decisive total British victory that completely redrew the map. But long before official declarations of war were signed, in Europe, the spark was struck in 1754 along the rugged American frontier, driven by intense competition for control over the very fertile Ohio River Valley. Think of this as the absolute highest value objective on a strategic map like in Risk or Civilization. Whoever controls this territory has the key to the entire continent, as the Ohio and Mississippi rivers served as the primary superhighways for trade, troop movements, and territorial expansion. So both the colonies of Pennsylvania and Virginia laid claim to the vital region, but the French acted first to lock down the area by constructing a chain of military forts along it. And upon learning about this, Virginia's royal governor dispatched the 22-year-old Major George Washington to deliver a formal ultimatum to the French to evacuate. The French officers politely dismissed the young Virginians' warnings and refused to abandon their positions. Washington returns empty-handed, but the imperial dispute was definitely far from over. So a young Washington accidentally triggered a massive global war after a disastrous wilderness skirmish and a hasty retreat that ended in total surrender. So basically, in the spring of 1754, Washington returns to the Ohio River Valley, commanding 150 inexperienced militiamen and a group of Native American allies. His objective was to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio, the strategic convergence points of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, and this is where Pittsburgh stands currently, so in case you're curious. This location was the ultimate gateway to the west, but by the time Washington arrived, the French had already built Fort Duquesne here on the site. Determined to strike first, Washington set up camp 40 miles away and ambushed a French scouting party, killing 10 soldiers, the very first casualties of the French and Indian War. Knowing the French would retaliate with overwhelming force, Washington hastily constructed a makeshift wooden stockade called Fort Necessity, and overconfident in his position, he called the surrounding meadows a charming field for an encounter. But July 3rd, 1754, a massive French and native force attacked during a torrential downpour, and the Battle of Great Meadows raged all day long, and with a third of his 300 men killed or wounded, Washington was forced to surrender. To add insult to injury, the French commander tricked Washington into signing a surrender document written in French, in which Washington unknowingly admitted to assassinating the French officer in the earlier ambush, and France secured the Ohio Valley, and Washington suffered a humiliating defeat. Yet the British politician famously noted that the volley fired by young Virginians in the backwoods of America would set the world on fire. British officials were terrified that an impending war with France and their Native American allies would completely wipe out their American holdings. To avoid a catastrophic game-over screen, they ordered the northern colonies to assemble a unified defensive strategy. In June of 1754, 21 representatives from 7 colonies met in Albany, New York, marking the very first time colonial leaders gathered to make a major joint decision. Ben Franklin stepped up as the ultimate party leader, proposing a bold meta-strategy known as the Albany Plan of Union. So this idea was to unite the 11 colonies under a single executive banner. And basically, this was an early prototype for the continental federal government that would come to exist later. But the plan called for a supreme president appointed directly by the king that would manage the regional affairs of all 11 colonies. So alongside this would be a grand council that was composed of elected colonial delegates holding real legislative authority, and crucially, this council would manage all relations, treaties, and trade with Native American tribes, replacing the fractured local policies with one powerful centralized command for the colonies. Franklin even published his famous Join or Die snake cartoon to rally support, warning everyone that a divided team was doomed to fail here. And however, this ended up proving too radical for both sides. Imperial officers in London hated the idea because they only wanted a basic temporary military alliance and a powerful colonial super government that might eventually challenge British control. And meanwhile, individual colonial assemblies refused to sign off on the deal because they were fiercely defensive of their own local power. Decades later, a reflective Franklin argued that if the colonies had embraced his plan of unified defense under the crown, it might have delayed or even potentially have prevented the American Revolution entirely. So, the British military decided that diplomacy was officially off of the table, so kicking off an aggressive multi-front campaign to completely wipe New France off of the map. In June 1755, British forces launched a massive amphibious assault, capturing key fortifications, protecting French Acadia and present-day Canada, but what followed was an absolute human tragedy known as the Grand Derangement, or the Great Expulsion. British authorities forcibly removed 11,500 Acadian settlers from their homes, burning their villages to ensure that they couldn't return, and many of these displaced French families eventually navigated their way to Spanish-controlled Louisiana. And over generations, the word Acadian evolved into Cajun, all right, laying the cultural foundation for the vibrant music, language, and gumbo-loving culture of southern Louisiana today. It is a striking historical reminder of how imperial border wars can rewrite the cultural geography of an entire continent. And then back on the mainland, the British government dispatched 1,000 elite red-coated regular soldiers across the Atlantic to forcibly evict the French from the Ohio country once and for all. At first, American colonists eagerly applauded this massive flex by the British military muscle, cheering the arrivals of their protectors against the French aggression. However, it introduced a subtle, dangerous precedent in colonial life. While colonists initially welcomed redcoats as a protective shield against a rival empire, they would deeply regret this military presence just a few decades on. The exact same regular troops sent to secure the frontier would eventually be deployed to enforce colonial parliamentary laws, police the colonial harbor towns, and quarter themselves in civilian neighborhoods. And that shifting dynamic transformed the regulars from welcome guardians into an intimidating occupying force, setting the stage for anti-military paranoia in the colonies. A rigid, overconfident British general marched a massive army into the North American wilderness by the name of General Edward Braddock. He openly disdained Native Americans. He refused to negotiate with potential allies or grant them any land rights, arrogantly declaring that no savage should inherit this land. And he was accompanied by young Washington, serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp. And Braddock's 1,400-man force spent weeks hacking a 125-mile road through the dense Allegheny Mountains toward Fort Duquesne. And he treated the wilderness march like a grand parade, expecting European-style line battles in open fields. But on July 7th, or 9th, 1755, as the column neared the fort, disaster struck near the Monongahela River. French soldiers, Canadian militiamen, and allied indigenous warriors ambushed the British column from behind thick trees and ravines. And while the British tried to form traditional firing lines in narrow woods, their hidden enemies poured onto them with devastating fire, and the Battle of Monongahela turned into an utter bloodbath. Braddock was mortally wounded, and out of the 1,373 soldiers that were there, 914 of them were killed or wounded, including 63 of their 86 officers. And amid the panic, Washington rallied the survivors and organized a desperate retreat, despite having 2 horses shot right out from underneath of him and 4 bullet holes ripping through his uniform. A stunned Washington wrote to his brother that the world-famous British regulars had been scandalously beaten by a trifling body of men and fled like sheep being pursued by hounds. If we were to answer this question, we might say something along the lines of Enlightenment thinkers applied reason and scientific inquiry to understand both the natural world and human society. Isaac Newton's laws of motion and gravity demonstrated that the universe operated according to natural laws, which inspired political philosophers like John Locke to argue that government should be based on rational principles. Locke's beliefs in natural rights, including liberty and self-governance, directly influenced revolutionary movements such as the American Revolution, and additionally deists like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin embraced the idea that human ignorance rather than inherent sinfulness caused most of society's problems, leading them to advocate for education and self-improvement as means to achieve progress. So, General Braddock's stunning defeat shattered the myth that the British Army was an unbeatable force, proving to the entire world that even imperial superpowers can suffer a devastating defeat. In the immediate fallout, France's Native American allies were emboldened to launch devastating attacks on the English frontier across western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, as hundreds of colonists were killed or captured, turning the frontier into a real-life survival horror game where danger lurked behind every tree. Pennsylvania's colonial government responded with extreme cruelty, offering cash bounties for Native American scalps, and this policy unleashed a vicious cycle of violence between 1755 and 1756. Yet despite all of this bloodshed in North America, Britain and France didn't officially declare war in Europe until May of 1756. This kicked off the 7 Years' War, which historians consider the world's original global conflict because it was fought across 5 different continents and 3 oceans, and under the weak leadership of King Louis XV, France was about to face a major defeat. Everything shifted whenever William Pitt took office as Britain's new prime minister, and he brought back peak main character energy to imperial politics, famously declaring that he alone could save the British Empire. Instead of forcing reluctant American colonists to foot the bill, which he had done and caused endless political friction, Pitt persuaded Parliament to fund the war effort directly. He promised to reimburse colonial assemblies of their expenses, which motivated the colonies to enthusiastically join in the fight, as Pitt assembled a massive military force of 45,000 British regular redcoats and colonial militiamen, effectively flooding the battlefield with overwhelming numbers. By August of 1759, this massive army captured key French strongholds like Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and Niagara, driving French forces back towards Canada. The ultimate turning point occurs in September of 1759 at the Battle of Quebec, when British General James Wolfe executed a high-stakes stealth operation straight out of Assassin's Creed. Under cover of darkness, 4,500 British troops secretly scaled the massive steep cliffs above the St. Lawrence River, surprising the French defenders of the Plains of Abraham at dawn, and the actual battle was over in a staggering 10 minutes. The French surrendered Quebec 4 days later, effectively breaking the back of New France. By 1761, France had completely and totally lost control of Canada, and its armies were trapped in brutal European battles, and its royal treasury was completely bankrupt. While minor skirmishes dragged on, the war in North America was essentially over, setting the stage for a massive geopolitical shift by 1763. On the morning of October 25th, 1760, the aging King George II drank his morning chocolate milk, stepped into his private closet, and suddenly dropped dead from a ruptured artery. This unexpected death launched his 22-year-old grandson onto the throne, King George III, and initially shy and wildly uncertain, young George III stepped right into the ultimate final boss battle of early modern history, ultimately overseeing Britain's historic victory over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War. That victory was officially sealed in February of 1763 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, an agreement that fundamentally redrew the geopolitical map of North America like a massive seasonal update in a strategy game. The terms of the treaty were absolute. Great Britain seized almost all of French claims east of the Mississippi River, including all of Canada, key sugar-producing Caribbean islands, and Spanish Florida. To compensate its ally Spain for losing Florida, France handed over the vast Louisiana territory west of the Mississippi River, including the critical port city of New Orleans. Just like that, France was completely wiped off mainland North America, and Great Britain flexed as the undisputed most powerful empire on earth. Across the Atlantic, British American colonists were absolutely ecstatic. The constant threat of the French military group and invasion on the Ohio River Valley had vanished overnight, and colonial merchants were enjoying the highest standard of living anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. So a New England minister even declared that Great Britain had reached the summit of earthly grandeur and glory, but as any gamer knows, maintaining a massive, newly conquered map comes with insane maintenance costs. Protecting that vast amount of territory required keeping a permanent standing army of 10,000 royal troops stationed in North America, placing an exhausting strain on Britain's national debt. Managing this newly expanded empire would soon spark intense economic and political friction between Great Britain and the colonies, setting up an unexpected conflict that no one saw coming. So we can kind of see what that territory looks like in 1713 and 1763. So the ink was barely dry on the Treaty of Paris before the British government executed a massive strategy shift, treating the American colonies less like valued partners and more like unoptimized cash cows. King George III and his cabinet quickly moved to clamp down on the colonies, starting by shutting down colonial policies that subsidized transatlantic passage for new immigrants. Since Britain was no longer dealing with overpopulation at home, imperial officials saw no reason to let the colonies keep leveling up their demographic stats. Next came the financial reckoning. Britain was carrying a staggering war debt from the 7 Years' War, and Parliament decided it was time for the colonies to start paying their fair share. To British leaders, this request felt like a totally fair trade. The average British citizen back in London was paying 26 times more annual taxes than what the colonialists were paying, yet the Crown was footing the bill to protect the American frontier. From Parliament's perspective, demanding a financial contribution was just splitting the bill after a massive team victory. But American colonists viewed the situation through a completely different lens. They argued that the old navigation acts, which were already forcing them to trade exclusively with Britain, acted as an invisible indirect tax. Trying to pile on direct taxes felt like changing the rules mid-game, and this ideological divide triggered an immediate wave of anxiety across the Atlantic. In December of 1763, a frustrated Connecticut minister perfectly captured the mood, lamenting, "It is a truly miserable thing that we no sooner leave fighting our neighbors, the French, but we must fall to quarreling amongst ourselves." The shared celebration over defeating France evaporates, replaced by suspicion and resentment, and by attempting to aggressively extract revenue and restrict colonial growth, King George didn't just tighten his grip, he set off a domino effect that would slowly push the colonies towards open rebellion. So imagine winning a multiplayer strategy game, declaring victory over your rival, and then suddenly realizing that the non-player characters on the map actually have full authority to wreck your entire base. Following the Treaty of Paris of 1763, American colonists were eager to expand westward across the Appalachian Mountains into the lands France had just ceded to Great Britain. However, Native American leaders were completely stunned to learn that the French had given away ancestral lands without so much as consulting them. So to make matters worse, the new British commander in North America, General Jeffrey Amherst, decided to drop a major policy patch. Amherst abruptly canceled the long-standing tradition of presenting diplomatic gifts to native leaders, a practice the French had mastered to build trust and maintain alliances. Ohio Valley tribes were instantly outraged, with Shawnee leaders complaining that as soon as the British defeated the French, they stopped caring about how they treated native nations. And in the spring of 1763, Chief Cornstalk and Ottawa Chieftain Pontiac united diverse tribes to launch a massive coordinated counteroffensive known as Pontiac's Rebellion. So as Pontiac bluntly reminded a British official, the French had never conquered native nations nor brought a single foot of their territory, meaning France had zero right to give that land over to King George. Native warriors captured nearly every British fort around the Great Lake region, and Ohio River Valley, striking fear into the heart of the backcountry, as the Pennsylvania Gazette reported a level of total panic that rivaled the fallout from General Braddock's defeat years earlier. So desperate for breaking the siege at Fort Pitt, General Amherst ordered an early form of biological warfare, distributing smallpox-infected blankets to surrounding native communities. So while British officials eventually sought a trade-based diplomatic peace with Pontiac, frontier colonists had zero interest in diplomacy, taking matters into their own hands like rogue vigilantes straight out of the Purge. A group of Scots-Irish farmers known as the Paxton Boys launched a horrific campaign in December of 1763, and furious at Pennsylvania's Quaker-controlled assembly for refusing to fund military defense, the Paxton Boys massacred 20 peaceful Conestoga Indians, and when surviving Christian Moravian Indians fled toward Philadelphia, 1,500 armed Paxton Boys marched on the city, threatening total chaos, and only a tense negotiation led by Ben Franklin managed to get them to stand down, exposing deep political and racial fractures that would continue to divide the American frontier. So, winning a massive war usually feels like unlocking full access to a giant open world map, but the British government immediately erected an invisible wall to block their own players. In October of 1763, King George issued the Proclamation Act of 1763, drawing a hard boundary line right along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, stretching all the way from Canada down to Georgia. And the Crown's goal was pretty simple: keep the peace with the Native American nations like the Delawares and the Shawnees by forbidding white colonists from settling west of the line, and ordering anyone else already living out there to pack up and move back east. This marked the absolute first time royal officials restricted colonial territorial expansion, and American settlers were absolutely furious about this. So Washington was so determined to secure prime real estate in the Ohio River Valley that he actively encouraged his agents to secretly survey lands anyway, treating the King's royal decree like a minor terms of service agreement that he could just bypass on his own. Despite the royal restriction, the proclamation completely failed to stop the physical tide of frontier settlement. Settlers continued to pour over the mountains into native homelands, prompting one indigenous leader to complain in 1767 that colonists were making more encroachments on their country than ever before, and this relentless push was fueled by a massive post-war boom in transatlantic immigration. With the French threat completely removed, moving to the American wilderness suddenly seemed far less risky to American colonists. While the French, or rather between 1763 and 1775 alone, we see that somewhere around 125,000 European immigrants, including English, Protestant, Irish, Scots, Germans, and Swiss, flooded into the colonies, along with 85,000 enslaved Africans. Most new immigrants were younger males who had served as apprentices to learn a new craft or trade. Many others, though, were poor farm families that would come over as indentured servants, and it would change the demographic landscape of North America. That's where we're going to stop.